need to talk about something. Do you know what frames per second is? Yeah, of course I do. Did you also know that you have 3 generic FPS settings that all have their own individual purpose? I knew that. Well, if you are one of those individuals, stick around because I'm going to show you how to master 24, 30, and 60 frames per second. And for those of you who are new here, I'm Benjamin Brandon. I'm a professional videographer that's worked in the industry for a while now on some pretty cool projects, and I've created this YouTube channel to teach everything that I know and everything that I continue to learn. If that's something that interests you, I would consider subscribing. So today, let's talk about frames per second. Frames per second is the amount of individual still images consolidated into a sequence that equals video. Like this video needed to happen. It just did. And as I mentioned earlier, you have 3 generic FPS settings on your camera. 24, 30, and 60 frames per second. Let's talk about 24 frames per second. Here's the funny part. 24 frames per second is actually what all of you are used to today because most movies are shot in 24 frames. When should you use 24 FPS? When you want to create that movie look, that cinematic film look. You get a motion blur. I'm shooting in 24 frames right now. You can see here my hand. You get some of the motion blur with my hand. The motion blur that you see gives you a real cinematic look to your video. The evolution of filmmaking during Charlie Chaplin days were shot at 16 frames per second. We now kind of evolved a little beyond that when we started to experiment and we found this interesting 24 frames per second. That just became the film standard. I don't see 24 FPS on my camera though. If you're on a digital camera, hence D in the SLR, it's actually because it's translated into 23.976 frames per second. So if you see that, use that. That gives you the 24 frame look. So just use 24 frames per second for short films, documentaries, or any type of cinematic film look. The purpose of 30 FPS is really to make things more realistic. It's probably the closest thing we can digitally capture that mimics what we see in the human eye. And because of that, most sitcoms and TV shows are shot at 30 frames per second. To give you the sense that you're kind of there with them and you kind of feel that you are a part of what's happening in that story. And last but not least, your local news shoots in 30 frames per second. So if your purpose is to create something TV-like, stick to 30. And last but not least, 60. Okay guys, the point of this whole video is literally for this point. I love y'all. You gotta learn how to do slow motion. You gotta do it. We're gonna do it here. If you're trying to do slow motion and you're not shooting at 60 frames per second, don't do it. Why am I saying that? Well, it's because I've been seeing it a lot lately. And for most of you, if not all of you, you have the ability and the means to get 60 frames per second. Well, Ben, my camera doesn't shoot in 60 frames per second. I don't have any fancy equipment like you do. Do you have one of these? It's fascinating what you can do nowadays with a smartphone. The vast majority of smartphones nowadays have 60 frames per second as an option. But here's the point. If you're trying to shoot in slow motion, switch from 24, 30 frames per second to 60. The reason being is you have more data, more still images to slow down, which makes it nice and buttery smooth. Let me show you an example of B-roll footage at 24 frames per second. Yeah, it wasn't the greatest. Did you notice the jitter at all? Now let's try that with 60. As you can see here, 60 frames per second makes this way better looking. It's just because you have 60 frames to play with and slow down versus just 24. When you try to slow down 24 frames per second, they actually duplicate each other, so now you get that weird jittery thing. So along with using 60 FPS for slow motion, you can also use it for B-roll. That way you have the option of slowing down or even doing a speed ramp like this. Typically you want to make sure you slow down 60 about 40% or so it keeps that smooth buttery cleanness there. With 120 frames per second, you can go far down as 20. So just make sure to use 60 frames per second for slow motion, B-roll, or any type of cool sequence that you want to try to slow down. And I believe that's all I got for you guys today, so that's a wrap. If this video did provide you some value, smash that like button for me, subscribe for more videos like this because it means the world to me, and I will see you on the next one. I'm out.